Hello lovelies. I suppose this is where I'm supposed to leapfrog off my popular anti-European video and slide to the libertarian right in my political thinking, garner thousands upon thousands of followers and that sweet ad revenue, maybe some sponsorships, then use that to springboard into a political career of some sort before finally winding up as governor of the American colonies in a resurgent British Empire. But that's not me. While I'm grateful that so many people have followed me and have taken me so close now, within striking distance of 2,000 followers, this is actually the point at which I self-sabotage by pointing out that I'm still not anti-EU, I'm still very much a Remainer, and then go on to explain why, thereby shedding most of the new followers that I've gained. But wait, let me make my case, let me say my piece, and please do continue to follow me in order to have a relatively polite and well-informed alternative point of view presented to you, because it's really important for everybody that we pierce our echo chambers and our bubbles and experience alternative points of view. And if you did follow me for that previous video, then you must like something about my presentation, the way I talk about things, what I know about things. So I would just beg you, please, to stay. And I do videos on all sorts of things. You might find something else interesting. But yeah, I'm still not anti-EU, so why? The objection a lot of people have to the EU is it's supposedly undemocratic. Now, from many continental European nations, that is probably a valid criticism, because most European nations have a far more representative system than even the EU has. There's much more proportional representation, there's a lot more local governance, a lot more localised powers, and so forth. Generally speaking, there are exceptions, of course. But Britain, compared to the EU, is very, very undemocratic. In the EU, everything is either elected directly, as is the case with MEPs, via proportional representation, which is the most representative, most democratic of the major electoral systems out there, and everything else is indirectly elected. So you elect your home government and they put people forward for the European councils, the Commission, things like that. So you're indirectly democratically involved in those decisions, in that the government that you have chosen to put in charge chooses those people, and then the president of one of the councils is chosen from within the council. So yeah, that's fairly democratic, certainly when compared to Britain. In Britain we use the first past the post political system, that's massively unrepresentative, leads to a lot of distortions like tactical voting and so on, and makes it especially vulnerable to things like boundary changes and so forth, which is an argument we're currently having in the UK. The House of Lords is not elected. You can argue that some of them are selected by whichever government happens to be in charge at the time, but you can't really remove them, at least not very easily. And while we elect our MPs, we do not elect the executive, the Prime Minister, and we certainly don't elect the Queen, so our head of state is unelected. Compare that to pretty much any European state and you can see that Britain lags way behind when it comes to democracy. We are not a very democratic nation. We tend to end up, we don't at the moment, but we tend to end up with powerful governments with strong majorities that can push through their agendas with little in the way of opposition. So the EU, by comparison to the UK, is massively more democratic than our system. Much has been made of Sargon and Dankula's trip to the EU and seeing how the sausage was made and saying how it's not particularly democratic from their point of view, in that aides and so on prepare shortened versions of papers and so on, and position statements for the various people. But that's the same also in the UK government and in the American government. These massive great bills don't get read by most of the people who end up voting on them. They get summaries of summaries of summaries, and they get advisors and poll numbers and so on, and that more guides their vote than them actually reading the legislation and discussing it on its merits. Yeah, this is a problem, but it's not limited to the EU. It's as democratic or more democratic than the UK system. So I have a very British perspective on the EU, and the other aspect to this is that our local home government is quite repressive. I've done some videos recently about various aspects of censorship and so on in the UK, particularly when it comes to pornography. So we're going to need a porn license essentially soon, unless that gets legally challenged. Please do go to resistav.com and give money to help with that, even if you're outside the UK. And the EU has been a bulwark against our own government's attempts to remove our civil rights, our rights to free expression, free speech, our rights to sexual expression. It's also gotten in the way of various human rights and workers' rights violations that the UK government has wanted to put through. Theresa May, as Home Secretary, even though she came out for Remain during the campaign, she was very much against these EU guarantees and protections on various rights and so forth. So if we did not have the protection of the EU, our own home government would be way, 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 way more repressive and even oppressive than it already is. Besides the rights protections and so on that I've already mentioned, the EU does a lot of good shit, at least from my perspective. You may well probably disagree in some of this, but it does redistribute wealth around the EU. Deprived areas get EU funding, and that's often the only real social investment funding that they get. Here in the UK, for example, we have several regions, areas, cities that are amongst the poorest in Europe, and also London, I think, is the only one that's in the richest top 10 in Europe. And those deprived areas, which ironically voted very much for Brexit, are the ones who have benefited the most from the European Union redistributing this funding. Also, being together in one cohesive socio-economic bloc gives Europe the ability to talk and negotiate on the larger world stage, rather than individual nations being constantly wrangled and sidelined by the big boys, China, the USA, and increasingly India. So this is the way the kind of arrow of history is moving, these larger co-prosperity areas. And Europe is a good way of moving forward with that in a democratic framework. Those of you in the States, you are part of a federal system. The European Union operates like a much looser version of your United States, with much more in the way of devolved power to the states that make up its overall size. So in a lot of ways it's very similar to what a lot of Americans want. You know, more states' rights, more local influence and so forth, but without doing away with the federal structure entirely, because it's not even a federation yet. People want to move it that way, other people don't. That's something that will be wrangled as time moves on, but there are advantages to having that larger supranational organisation in terms of trade, military, political clout in general, so it's very useful for that. Another controversial vote passed the other day, I think that's an Article 7 vote or something, to do with Hungary. Now, Hungary has been sliding towards becoming a much more repressive area. It's curtailed press freedoms and so on, and the EU has said, hey, if you're going to be in our club, you can't behave like that, and has started the process of essentially punishing Hungary's government for being repressive to its own citizens. And I guess you can take two different views on this. One, that it's immoral or should be illegal or whatever else for someone to interfere in their local politics. My point of view is that this is one of the reasons for the EU, just as it was one of the reasons for the UN to help stave off and prevent the arising of tyranny and the abrogation of people's human rights. It's kind of ironic that this takes place at the same point as Article 13, which is taking away people's rights, but it shows that, you know, the EU giveth and the EU taketh away. When it comes to Hungary, I'm sorry, but I think interference is warranted. It's not like individual nations have never interfered in another nation and their local politics. It happens all the time, whether it's the Russians or whoever else, and the Brexit vote or the American presidential election. You may not agree that these things have happened, but if you look back historically, certainly to the Cold War, I think we can all agree that nations have been invested in the politics of other nations and have exerted influence on them. Whether we agree or not, this is something that goes on, and I would rather it went on for good reasons, as it has with Hungary and the EU. Yeah, these are important reasons, things that were brought up by Project Fear, about how the EU was a way of preventing things getting really bad, like they did prior to and during World War II. So these are all good reasons to still be for the EU. With any government, it's a compromise. You have to take the rough with the smooth. With any organisation, it's the same. I mean, you can nail your colours to the mast. It doesn't mean you have to go along with everything that they do. I mean, I begrudgingly supported New Labour. I was very excited in '97 when they got in, and they did an awful lot of good stuff. They moved too far to the right for me, so I had protests about that, and I was against the war. But overall, you know, I could still support that party. It's not about a single policy or a single decision or whatever else. And nationalism doesn't excite me either. I have no particular attachment to the arbitrary lines on a map I happen to have dropped out of my mother's belly into. It doesn't really mean anything to me, unless we start to argue about history. Then I get quite animated. But otherwise, I mean, I didn't do any of these historical things. The nation does its own thing with or without me. I can't vote on individual policies, only on parties. Why would I feel attached to it? It doesn't make any sense to me. I understand you might differ, and that's fine. But me, I view myself as a human being first, and I have a very internationalist, not globalist, internationalist perspective on how we should conduct ourselves politically and collectively as a species. So I'm still for the EU, even if it's made bad, stupid decisions when it comes to intellectual property and the internet. But the UK is a bit hold my beer compared to the EU when it comes to that, so sorry. Take it easy. Zang.
To the sky and watch it burn, 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 burn.
This is horrible what happened today. See, I don't like the, I have, okay, like a lot of you, I hate a lot, you know? But I hate with style and creativity.